Welcome to the ITSPmagazine podcast network. You are about to listen to the After 40 podcast with Dr. Deborah Heiser. Whether you're seeking inspiration, guidance, or a fresh perspective on the rich possibilities life offers after 40, this podcast is your go-to source.
Welcome to After 40. I'm so excited to share this session with you today because I have Corey Bearak with me. And Corey Bearak is a seasoned attorney and government and public affairs counsel based in Queens, New York. And for almost 50 years, he's blended public service and legal strategy to help public officials, unions, businesses, and nonprofits navigate complex policy and media landscapes. Corey's been involved in communities long before it became the talk of the town, where people are talking about how important it is to connect and become involved in your community. There's been so much talk about things like social prescribing and connections and community that can be of service to individuals. And Corey has been involved in this longer than some people have been alive. So I'm thrilled to have this amazing expert here with me today. Welcome, Corey.
Thanks, Deborah. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Well, I have a couple of questions for you. You have spent almost 50 decades shaping public policy and building local organizations. What role has community played in your own personal fulfillment, especially after 40?
It's interesting. Obviously, it's staying connected, and the relationships you build sometimes in some cases, turn social as well. And it's nice when you can blend in that way. I think that's the one thing. And I've always been about making a difference. And I felt always working with community gives you a certain grounding, and it gives you a base that you're not just out there for yourself, but by showing that you're working in coalition with others, there's people who share in that, in those goals, whether it's because you convinced them or worked with them to develop it, as the case may be. But when you're working in tandem with others, you're in a stronger place to make things happen. Because when people are responding, they're not just responding to you. Sometimes your reputation helps and people want to maybe will open a door to you or be willing to listen to you. But knowing that there's others who concur with that point of view, with that policy proposal, with that reform, it helps the chances of making it happen. And throughout my career, I've tried to reach out to build coalitions, whether it's been on the political side, whether it's been on the community side, or sometimes a combination of both, to make things happen or to engender support so things can happen. And sometimes they happen soon. Sometimes it's a process and it can take years and years and years, but you don't let go. I talk about it as every good idea finds its time.
Oh, that's a great saying. And that's so true. Things don't always happen immediately. And that takes a special person to be able to ride something out that feels like it could be impossible in the beginning. Is there any example of one that feels the most exciting to you, one that maybe took a while, but really, ended up being something bigger or better than you thought it would be?
Well, I don't know about bigger or better, but, a case in point was when I was first got active. police response times in my community were always horrible, and and part of it was uh, a reflection of the fact that the geography of the community and the police precinct area was just too large geographically to cover back and forth. Essentially, the running from like the to almost Kennedy Airport in the south to North Shore Towers in the north, hugging the eastern border of Queens. So you know, people who can envision that see it's a big geographic area, if you will, and you know, you're talking about, you know, something that you traverse on a highway, you know, in 25, 20, 30 minutes in some cases. So imagine throwing in local streets. So obviously, police response times to crimes in progress just weren't working. And as I got in government, there was an opportunity to require the publication of those response times across the city. And using that, ultimately made a case to create a second precinct for covering that community. And eventually we finally got it. You know, we're talking about something that dated back to the 70s when I was just out of college. And now, you know, almost 40 some odd years later, we were close to getting something funded. It got funded. And then when we had when there was a movement to defund the police, that became a misguided casualty of the budget process. And we had to fight again in coalition to get it back in and funded, which we did. And we had the opening towards the end of last year, and it was a really wonderful experience to see. And the interesting part about it is that the physical new precinct was not in my neighborhood; it was in the southern portion of the community, if you will. So you know, we're working in tandem, and the demographics of my community are not the same as the community where the precinct is. So you had a diversity of demographics, if you will, of populations working together. And, you know, there's other examples of doing that, but I think working in coalition like that is just a wonderful thing. So, I mean, that's just one thing that I can point to because it shows an example of that and also of persistence.
So tell me, what was the police response time, you know, more than 40 years ago, and what is it now? Has it increased? Has it decreased?
Well, that's what we're hearing. I don't have the firm numbers now, but you know, we were talking about significant, you know, more than 5 minutes, and sometimes that time was not even counting the time somebody places a call, goes to the 911 system before a car is actually dispatched as well. So it was significant. You know, you need to be within a couple of minutes for it to make it even sensible. And if there was only one car on a tour overnight and they're all by the airport, they're not going to get to where my community is to even make a difference. So now you're basically if you cut the patrol area in half, if you will, those cars are going to be, you know, more likely to get around and respond.
Most people complain about things. They'll say, "Oh, I don't like the police response time." And they'll talk about other things that bother them, but they don't know that they can be change makers. And that obviously change takes time. And I love that you, first of all, have your Mets hat on, which represents Queens. But I don't know that everybody knows how important it is that what you're saying, because Queens has 2 airports. It has multiple stadiums that house so many people for events. The stadium for the Mets. It has the Arthur Ashe for tennis. It has the Belmont Raceway, which is, I don't know if it's part in Queens or all in Queens.
One of the parking lots is in Queens. I'll say it that way. But,
okay.
And you know, when you're going south on the Cross Island, that you're going from Nassau to Queens to Queens to Nassau, and finally you get off. Yes, so, but it is just on the border, and of course, obviously, the
And
former aqueduct tract.
And yes, and there's also a casino. People don't realize how many places exist that are bringing people into Queens and out of Queens and moving through Queens beyond just the community members who live there. So, the fact that you have been working so diligently within the community to make change, even if it's not in your direct neighborhood, is something that anybody could really do. They could get involved and make change in their community. And likely their community is not as complex as Queens, because Queens has so much in it. It's a really, it's a
Right.
vast community.
I think the thing to emphasize is you don't necessarily have to be a pro to do this. In other words, I've been in government
Yeah.
about half my career and out of government the other half of my career, basically doing the same kind of work. Just who is paying for it is just different. Private clients versus the taxpayers, I guess. But you don't need to be the professional. You can work with people who are more professional about it, but you don't necessarily have to be the professional. When I think of a time when I was in government and a neighborhood in New Hyde Park along Langdale Street, there seemed to be a lot of accidents and the like, and it was this street, maybe a quarter of a mile or less, just west of Lakeville Road, which was a major artery. So it became like a through street, and there were like no stop signs the whole length of it. And this group, community members got together on their own. They weren't really even involved in their local civic, and they coalesced and did petitions and all that, and went work with the office where I was the chief of staff and counsel to the council member. And eventually, where there were no traffic controls, the length of that strip, a number of traffic controls, four-way stop signs, and the first of its kind, what's called a rest on red traffic light, where it was burning red at all four sides, and then you get there, and then it will change to let you go.
Mhm.
It was the first of its kind anywhere in New York, maybe even in the country, I think.
Wow.
And so they weren't necessarily sophisticated on their own, but they worked with my office, and I gave them a lot. So they were, let's say, the energy and the persistence. And then, working with their local elected official
Yeah.
and the staff, they were able to get all these things to happen over a short period of time. And, that strip became safer. And, part of the issue is, on the Nassau side, just across the border, there was less development, less stores and stuff. There was Lake Success, but there wasn't this whole development of office and other spaces on the across from Lake Success, when it was just a Sperry Rand place. And when that place closed down, it got developed into a whole bunch of office parks. So I think the amount of traffic that was coming through increased, kind of very quickly. So it was a need to address a traffic situation on a community side street that no one knows. And I think of it, if that same thing happened, today, if you will, when we have, guides like Waze, a lot of people would even be more,
Yeah.
diverted
big
to
help.
that location to save traffic lights, or whatever. So it gets interesting, when you think of it in that context. But the point was, thinking back to the people who were the leaders of that group, nobody necessarily was really a professional of any kind. There were some retirees, and they coalition. We worked with them, and they were rather active. And one of them,
So
they had
how did they become active, Corey? What advice would you give to somebody over 40 looking to build or strengthen their own community involvement? Where do they go? Who do they talk to?
well, I think you try to find out who your local community association is, if there isn't. And if not, maybe knock on some doors and say, hey, we should form a block association, form a community group. but often you might be involved in something else. You might have started with the PTA, you might have started with a little league or other youth athletic association, um, a church or a synagogue or a mosque that you might have be connected to. So through those things, you might have been involved in a fraternal organization. So you may otherwise know a group of your neighbors anyway, and it may not necessarily be, a homeowner or a tenant group. It could be that, you're a bunch of people who go to this park and you want to keep it clean and stuff like that. So you try to, form up in that way. And sometimes the local elected officials may be helpful in guiding people who say, hey, I want to do this. But often the groups already exist. Sometimes they're looking for new leadership. You know, Oftentimes the civics have retirees running it, maybe because of time, but they might have not. Some of them might have been working professionals or just workers when they started out, but they can't get that next person to come up. So it would be nice for other people to step forward. It's an interesting call because sometimes people don't want to devote the time, but they'll complain about what goes on.
Yeah.
And,
And that's tricky, Corey, for people, because I think a lot of people don't realize how connected they really are. Like you mentioned, religious, faith-based organizations that are in our communities that people may be involved in, but not really plugged in or connected, or PTA or sports organizations, even the local gym, the Rotary, all of those organizations that are right there in a community. And, it can be frustrating for people who say, I wish that the traffic would change. But if they knew they could just plug in so easily to some of the local
right.
organizations.
But I think also the change that sometimes happens, like Queens is very much, a series of neighborhoods where there's a lot of change in terms of new communities, new families coming in, maybe from different ethnicities. And usually, like when one person comes in from one background, others kind of follow, and they may not be used to organizing in a typical civic or block association way. They may want to form as their ethnic community. And there's nothing wrong with that too, if that's a way of organizing
Yeah.
and working for the community. And when I was forming with my friend Sean Walsh, the Queens Civic Congress, which was a borough-wide coalition of all the civic and community groups, we talked about maybe reaching out to those parts of Queens where people were organizing by maybe their native country or other ethnicity basis, because if that's how they were organizing, at least they were organizing for their community.
Yeah.
And we talked about that. Our successors in the organization never followed through with that, but we had actually amended our bylaws to allow that kind of association in, because the idea is to try to be representative.
Yeah.
And but it's something to be mindful of. It's how people come together in coalition, to gather in community, varies, and you have to adapt to that when you reach out. And
So
it just,
do you
yeah.
think, you're talking about bringing people together in really complex ways, and not all communities have that same complexity, but all have the need to come together. So how does being rooted in community influence a person's sense of purpose or even mental health as we age? Do you think that there's an impact on that beyond, changing policies or ways that communities work? Do you think that it has a bigger influence on a person?
I think that they know that there's somebody to look in for them. If somebody doesn't come to a meeting, for example, after a period of time, um, somebody might say, why aren't they here? And maybe somebody calls them, knocks on a door. You may, God forbid somebody is ill or worse or fell. So the point is, you check up on. Like if you just the concept, if you didn't hear from a friend or a family member, you may call, you may reach out, to find something and perhaps avert something tragic. And I think about it. As you know, I chair the board of a senior center, which I'm fortunate to have you now as a newer board member. And we have a Meals on Wheels program, and part of that also is that home delivered meal can be a connection to that person who never comes to the center.
Yeah.
And if they
Yeah.
don't answer the door and there's an issue, we have somebody who now can report back and say, hey, there's a need, and so so it's not just the meal, it's the contact. So I think, I use that as just one of the example, but when you
You
come
bring
to
up a good point with You bring up a good point with that, Corey, and that is that partake of things that are available to you in your community, because you don't just have to go in and lead to make change. Everybody who, is a part of that senior center and who's receiving meals is then woven into the community. So people are looking in on them without even.
right. But even the people who come to the center, they're exposed to opportunities and there are people who may not have needs or rather self-sufficient. They may be acting as mentors in what people need.
Yeah.
We don't talk about it. Usually we talk about it in the professional, in the workplace sense, but in terms of what those people might need, and they may have tips for those people about what they may need in their lives, whether it's financial, whether it's little tips about how to get through a health issue because they were through it perhaps.
Yeah.
And then obviously, whatever programs and assistance that, people who have more needs can take advantage of because they're coming to the center and exposed to it. I think some of the biggest problems are people, you made the point of people not taking advantage of things like there's programs at the libraries.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of outreach that's done, but there's still a lot of people who, for whatever reason, get none of it, whether it's because they're not connected to the internet and they're not receiving those emails or choose not to receive those emails, or they just choose not to go there. People can just sort of stay homebodies, but, there's efforts to reach out, and we talk about it as like to be culturally sensitive, if you will. And so there's all sorts of efforts and an emphasis to do that, yet it doesn't always translate and reach, not for one in trying. So it's always like an ongoing endeavor. And, it's important that those who are aware of things, certainly share it. And the other side of it is trying to figure out where do those people go, so you may not just go to a civic association. You may go to faith-based leaders to get a word out about something. And so it's that kind of dialogue and outreach that you always need to look to do and to have those relationships, to have Rolodexes, to work with others. I think about it, my daughter works for the American Jewish Committee in a role in their New York office, and she often has to reach out to others, and she's able to call, reach out to me and to say, Dad, who do you know in this area? And not just in the political and public office sphere, but there could be connections, even though I'm Jewish, there can be connections I have with clergy or leaders in other communities, for example, that, I'll make introductions for her that she can make use of. One of our fellow board members, our vice chair, Reverend Dr. Evelyn Miller-Suber, is a pastor, and Marissa needed a connection to. They were doing a Jewish Black clergy council of some kind, and I connected Evelyn to Marissa for that purpose because she's very involved in the AME church, and that proved helpful, for example.
You do that all the time with people. You're a prolific mentor. You are so connected and understand how how connections can be made that might not be obvious to other people because you're so embedded in your community. So, how does mentorship play in all of this? Do you find that mentorship is something you fell into? Have you always been mentoring?
Well, I think I first would say I was mentored. And I may not even have known it in the beginning when I first got involved in politics and stuff, and probably even as a student, not even thinking about it, that different teachers perhaps took an interest in me. I didn't think about it at the time. It wasn't, but there was that going on. But I'm thinking about when I first got involved politically and governmentally, many of the people who were otherwise involved, and even in civics, most of those people were closer to my grandparents' age than even my parents' age, if you will. It was almost like the generation was skipped. So me coming along and looking to be active, they were more than willing to share information, perhaps even share what I used to call war stories. In other words, things. So hearing those stories, maybe I will avoid making that mistake that somebody else made because I had that history and that analogy shared with me. So I understood things, for example, that I'll tell others about, how to work through people instead of maybe going around them, respecting existing lines of communication so somebody doesn't get upset, as simple as that. But so, those kind of things were rather, I think, helpful. I didn't, just people were willing to help. The press secretary when I was working for the Department of State between college and law school, and New York State Department of State, the press secretary gave me some guidance when I was trying to do some press things for one of my community things, for example, and I picked up on that and was able, over time, to have a media aspect to my career, even though that wasn't the main thing. But I have found that I was always dealing with and have a relatively robust Rolodex of people in the news media. And what's interesting about it is, some of the people who I was starting out with, let's say when I was working early in government and they were at City Hall, some of them are in significant places at a higher level, all across the media, including on TV and stuff. So it's interesting, and those relationships stay on. You still stay in touch with them, even if not social, but you're still staying in touch with them. And if you sent them an email or called them, they will pick up the phone and respond. So it's interesting in that regard.
What you're basically saying is that for you, mentorship has been organic, and you have never used it as something reciprocal. By you saying, you stay in touch and you keep those connections going so that later you may call upon that person, they may call upon you, but that remains consistent. For you, one thing I'm hearing is how important connection is. You don't just call and say, hey, can you do me a favor? And you're done with that person. You're developing your connections in ways that are richer and deeper than that.
The connection or the ask may not happen for years.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it. And sometimes you're not even making that ask for yourself. Somebody we know rather closely, I'll not out the person by name, but you can think of that person rather, not a young person, if you will, had an issue with a motor vehicle. And I was able to go to somebody at the Department of Motor Vehicles in a significant position who knew exactly how to help solve that quagmire. And I've never had to make that ask for me.
Right.
And as I remember it, this person at one point reached out to me on LinkedIn to connect or something like that. So that's how I developed a relationship with this person, kept it up. And lo and behold, when somebody had a crazy problem, it became a lot easier to deal with it. I don't know if that person didn't know me, how they would have got around to fixing it.
Right.
And that person is an accomplished person. And that's what's interesting about it. You can be really well-versed, rather accomplished, successful, knowledgeable in your tunnels, if you will, in your spaces, yet in another space, you could be less than a novice.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how do you know enough to know to negotiate that issue and find the help, build the relationships around that? So, you can't just say I'm a generalist or something like that. It's a question of sometimes knowing where to go and get help. In other words, I may not be the person to fix the wiring in my house. I may know a little bit about it. I may be reluctant to deal with it, even what little I know, just because it's electric and I may not want to touch it. But there's people I know I can call on. And at the same time, those people might reach out to me for the stuff I know.
Yeah.
And so,
That's lateral mentoring.
yes, it is lateral
So that
mentoring.
is something that when I have watched you, you embody that. I can't tell you how many times your name has come into my ear from someone. And, I don't go and tell you all of this, but your name comes into my ear because people will say, oh, Corey knows that. Corey knows how to fix that. Corey knows somebody who knows about that. Corey, Corey, Corey. And it's because you are at the center of what is like a spider web of connections that are
Yeah.
really lateral in many
I've never
ways.
used the word spider web, if you will. You often talk about concentric circles. That's how I've thought about it. That even when I was in high school, I thought about it, that I was involved or connected to a lot of groups and different people, but there would be people in one group who would have nothing to do with the people in the other group.
Yeah.
But I was connected with them, and they would probably never be in the same place unless I had a gathering that I called, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
There's like that saying the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but it's like 3 degrees of Corey Bearak if you're anywhere near Queens. You have your hand in so many different circles. I like that visual. And other people can be like you too. I think that, I hadn't heard about anybody having the connections that you have that are not for personal gain, that most people will say, I'm going to gather a Rolodex so that I can promote myself in some way without making change. Your connections are for making change. And it's unbelievable. I think that if people can approach life from a civic minded or servant minded way of being, I see how you really have so many people thinking so well of you. People will do whatever they can for you, and are there thinking positively about you because you have been there in the community for others in so many different ways. I think that you embody what it's like not to be in a reciprocal relationship, but in a connected relationship with others, even when you're trying to make change.
yes, yeah, I think about that often, and it's it's something that I feel good about,
Yeah.
uh, and it's something with feeling good about making things happen, and and to have meaning in that sense. Um, but the interesting side of it is you can be this wealthy person like Bill Gates, and now you're at the pinnacle of your career, at the end stage, you're giving away all this money and stuff, and that's okay too. And so it's so on the other hand, could I have been somebody like that, and then did it in a different way? There's so there's all sorts of different ways of helping, and to some extent, in my case, it's my time, more or less, my time and expertise, more than my personal wealth, if you will, that I'm offering up. And sometimes some people are more interested in, chasing the checkbook, if you will, than that
Well, there are
resource.
3 ways that we can be generative, and generative is something that we're built to do, which is to give back to others, right? And the 3 ways we can do that are volunteering, philanthropy, and mentoring. And you have really, for 5 decades, been involved in volunteering and mentoring others, making your community stronger by teaching others how to get engaged and how to, really navigate in a system where you become a part of it. You're not just taking from it. And there's a real value in that. Changes in our whole world or communities happen because of that. We need that. And that's a real value. When we think of end of life, I've worked with so many people at the end of life, and they don't care about their stuff. They care about the people in their lives. And I think that most of us, when we're in our prior to or in our midlife, realize that we want to have a footprint. And you are a guide for others who want to have a big footprint. You can do that with volunteering and mentoring, and that can give you an enormous footprint in the world.
That is true. And it's interesting because I have stuff, and it's interesting is, it's accumulates if you look to move, and obviously we're an empty nest household. And if we were to move, might there be stuff that doesn't come along, and how to address that? I have a whole file cabinet worth of news clippings. I've talked about, maybe scanning them because they're probably not going to go to the next location if there is a move, for example.
The whole empty nest and downsizing, that's a whole separate discussion.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is,
you're right.
The point is, if I move somewhere, are all those plaques and stuff that you see behind me, are they going to be boxed and never to be seen? Because
yes,
because that's a Corey space. It's not a Corey and Rochelle space, if you will. If there was like a den in a new place, that might have a desk for me still. It might not be appropriate to have all those things up there in what might be a space that's more communal with my wife, as an example.
Yeah.
Even though on the other side of the screen, there is, let's say, that kind of space in my office, in what is my office here.
I do love that I can see behind you and all of the awards and things that you have up on your wall, which don't show everything that you do or have done, but it really is nice to know that you have made such an impact in your community. And I'm hoping that people who listen today are going to be able to take away some of the points that you've made about how you can receive services in your community, look for services for yourself, but also get involved in your community, because it really does help with making change for yourself and for your community. So, Corey, thank you for coming on today. You've made a difference in my life. You've made a difference in the Mentor Project and in so many organizations and in your own community in Queens. So thank you, Corey, for making the world a better place.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the After 40 podcast with Dr. Deborah Heiser, part of the ITSPmagazine podcast network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to the ITSPmagazine YouTube channel, and share the ITSPmagazine podcast network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit ITSPmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.